Liam Fox.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure, as always, to follow the honourable member for West Ham. Although I feel like I must correct her on one thing. The House was not denied the opportunity to take this bill forward. The fact was that only 68 members from across the entire House supported the motion for closure. That is a measure of support across the whole House. Mr Deputy Speaker, there has been actually a fairly large measure of consensus on a number of issues in this debate today. The most important is that there is a consensus in this House of Commons that coercive practices that attempt to change by force the legitimate and legal beliefs and practices of any individual in our society has no place in the 21st century. It is worth reiterating that right at the start. It is also, I believe, not for the state to interfere in the non-harmful behaviour of any citizen, including the right to freely express their sexuality, which, as a doctor, I believe, is simply part of a natural spectrum of human behaviour. It is also worth making clear that we have a consensus on that matter. But I do believe that we do have a duty to protect the vulnerable from undue pressure from whichever direction that comes from and for whichever reason. And I very much agree that we need to protect individuals, in the cases that I mention, from undue pressure to not express themselves in a way that would be untrue to their natural character. That is not an acceptable thing to do in a civilised society, but we must also, in the wider debate around trans issues, be willing to protect young people from undue influence from those who may have different motivations, from making decisions which may be irreversible, and that with a different level of maturity and experience they may choose to make differently for themselves. There were a couple of contributions I think were of particular value. The honourable member for the Gower talked about the particular risk of people being inadvertently drawn into the scope of this bill through behaviour that they believed to be legitimate. For example, challenging young people so that they could get the benefit of experience in terms of what their parents might advise them to do, and also how the medical profession could inadvertently be brought in if a practitioner had expressed a particular view in private about the issues and then was asked to give advice. These are very complex issues. Now, I pay tribute to the honourable gentleman, who I think has genuinely tried to get round what are some pretty much immovable objects when it comes to law in this area. And I'm grateful to the honourable member from Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath for reminding us that the debate is about people. It is not about abstract issues. It is about individuals and the impact that it has on their lives, and also how elements, at least of the medical profession, can be just as much subject to the whims of fashion and politics as any of the rest of the population. Now, I'm very glad, Mr Deputy Speaker, that this debate was conducted in general in a thoughtful tone. It could easily have degenerated into what we might call strongly held views or inadvertent self-righteousness. It did that only at very few points today, because it is a debate that does need to be dealt with in a proper tone, and we've seen in the wider debate to be dealt with in a proper tone, and we've seen in the wider debate too much assertion and too little rational debate. And the best example I can think to give the House of that was the treatment handed out to J.K. Rowling on her row in Twitter. And while, of course, we have to keep assessments of the volume of the response within the fact that it's the world of the Twitter sphere or the X sphere, I suppose it is now, that the vicious, extremely aggressive and often threatening language really has no place in our discourse on serious issues in this country. And what really struck me about that particular intervention was it was not that the writer herself was not entitled to post her views because of her background, as one critic put it, because her cis identity and its majoritarian privileges were overwhelming. But the sinister part for me was that it was not a counterattack or riposte to the views that she had posted, but an attempt to delegitimise her and thus her intervention. And I hope that, although this bill is not going forward, I hope that across the House we can understand and agree that wherever we come from on the political spectrum, we need to make it clear that those like J.K. Rowling, with the views that she has, are just as legitimate as the views of anyone else in that particular debate. And this aim to silence, to cancel, to delegitimise individual views has no part in a proper democratic debate in our country. Now, the honourable gentleman worked hard to try to get the bill into a better position. And good law needs to be necessary, clear, effective, enforceable, and to avoid unintended consequences. And like many in this House, I was not clear during the debate exactly what the necessity for the bill was, because I did not hear described in any clarity the sort of offences that would not be covered by legislation that is there already that would require yet another piece of legislation. And I look forward to when the Minister comes forward with the government's legislation, being very clear about exactly what it is that we are intending to outlaw, because we all understand the extreme elements that I think were the background to the debate, violent enforcement and so on. But what disturbed me about this was part of the explanatory notes given to us by the House of Commons Library, which actually said that the techniques can take many forms and commonly range from pseudo-psychological treatments to spiritual counselling. Now, this is where I had real reservations about where we were today, and where I felt it was unclear what the necessity for the legislation was. And of course, I give way to the honourable gentleman.
He says that he doesn't understand scenarios, or hasn't heard of scenarios in this debate which would be covered by the bill but isn't covered by legislation. But let me give him two scenarios that he has just mentioned there. An unregulated therapist, i.e. someone who's not part of any registered body, of which we have many in this country who do significant harm. There's another debate possibly about registering them. Can take a vulnerable person, and to some extent anyone who's questioning their sexuality or transgender identity to some extent at that moment is vulnerable because you are questioning, and can repeatedly tell them that they can't be that they should be ashamed of that they should be disgusted about that. That does not meet a criminal threshold. It might meet a threshold many years down the line of psychological harm, but we won't know. Surely that is a clear example where this bill, or a bill like it, will act, and he is suggesting that there is no examples?
There again, interventions should really be short. I understand the reason.
Deputy Speaker, if the point that the honourable gentleman makes is valid, then it's valid in the other direction too. It should be wrong, and in his case criminalised, to tell any young person that they are definitely something when they are unclear about what they are. And if that is what comes out of our debate today, that I think is a step forward in the wider debate around these issues. Now, I also had questions. I will very briefly, because there are still other members who want to speak.
Right, honourable friend. Does he agree with me that the noble Lord Winston put it very well in the other place when he said, the basic problem is this: we are at risk of legislating for a piece of biology that we really do not understand. We do not understand the underlying mechanisms.
I am very much the last one that would contradict the noble lord in any way whatsoever, but I think there were other elements in the bill that give me cause for anxiety, and I know these are part of the reasons why the government themselves have found bringing legislation forward difficult, because we talked on both sides of the House about the concept of the harm that could be done by these processes themselves, but there was no test of harm in the bill. Now, if all forms of conversion therapy covered by the bill can be harmful, surely it would be not unreasonable to have a test of intent to do harm prior to any prosecution being brought under the legislation, and yet that was not in the bill, and I believe that to have been a vital part that was missing from the bill, because this was about second-guessing people's intent rather than any concept of them wishing to do harm. That, I think, casts our net far too widely in law than we should have. And there were two other points in the drafting of the bill. The first was the point about activity as well as a course of action, meaning that a single event a one-off event, a one-off conversation, if interpreted in a particular way by a prosecutor, could bring people within the scope of the law. That needs to be tightened, and I say to my honourable friend the Minister, if the government is bringing forward legislation, that is something they need to look at, as is the use of the term suppress alongside terms of orientation and identity, in full or in part. Again, this loose language comes potentially unstuck when a parent has a strong and necessary challenge against their children in order to give them a different view, and it could be interpreted very wrongly if the wording of any legislation was in this way. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I'll say this, that we are here to produce good law in the House of Commons. We are not here to signal to any one part of the population or another that we are, quote, on their side. We have to ensure that the law that we produce has the intended effect and that that law is necessary. And I hope that my honourable friend will look at these elements closely in the days and months to come.